All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Agorist Project. I'm Steven. Last time we went over part one of Alpha and Omega, which is part one and two of the beginning and the end of the enemy of the state. Today, we're going to be going over part two, Omega, the end. So go ahead and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Agorist Project. You can go ahead and like us directly on the web blog page. It's going to be agoristproject.wordpress.com. So to open up this one here, we're going to go over the scripture verse from Matthew chapter 26, verses 50 through 56. The first point here is going to be the arrest. Jesus said, "My friend, go ahead and do what you have come for." Then the others grabbed Jesus and arrested him, but one of the men with Jesus pulled out his sword and struck the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. "Put away your sword," Jesus told him. "Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe what must happen now?" Then Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I some dangerous revolutionary that you have come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there teaching every day. But this is all happening to fulfill the words of the prophets as recorded in the scriptures." At that point, all the disciples deserted him and fled. So roughly 30 years after his birth, the infamous outlaw finally reemerges from hiding and comes back onto the scene. The following 3 years of Jesus' life would change the world forever. 3 years of pushing back against the statist agenda of one of the greatest superpowers the world has ever seen to ensnare society in the slavery of sin. Murder being under the guise of war, theft under the guise of taxation, and condemnation under the guise of courts. Time and again, they would seek to seize him, and time and again, he would slip through their fingers into the crowds like a thief in the night, stealing away the authority of kings and little by little returning it to the people. This was the ministry of Jesus, which led to his inevitable arrest. But upon Jesus' arrest, he didn't fight against the powers which intended to bring harm upon him. Not physically, for those who live by the sword die by the sword. Even Paul said, "We are human, but we don't wage war as humans do." 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 3. The revolution Jesus would lead against the principles and powers of the kingdoms of the world was a revolution of the mind. The revelation that the power of man is no more than an illusion from which he came to set us free. Living by the sword will only continue the cycle of men who wish to rule over men, and is a cycle Jesus intends for us to break. This goes into part two, called the trial. We open this up with Matthew chapter 27, verses 11 through 14. Now Jesus was standing before Pilate, the Roman governor. "Are you king of the Jews?" the governor asked him. Jesus replied, "You have said it." But when the leading priests and the elders made their accusations against him, Jesus remained silent. "Don't you hear all these charges they are bringing against you?" Pilate demanded. But Jesus made no response to any of the charges, much to the governor's surprise. So Jesus was charged with countless crimes as provided by the witnesses and false witnesses who had sworn to testify against him in the court of law. Yet the only crime that Jesus ever admits to committing is the crime of being their king, to which the Jews respond in John 19:15, "We have no king but Caesar." Jesus' own people, who were to be the forerunners in this revolution against the world powers, had pledged their fealty, their allegiance, to the very thing Jesus came to abolish, the state. When we as followers of Christ advocate state rule in our lives, we are declaring Caesar as king, to whom we offer Jesus to be crucified all over again. This is going to lead us into part three, the sentence. This is going to be Matthew chapter 27, verses 29 through 38. Some of the governor's soldiers took Jesus into their headquarters and called out the entire regiment. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. They wove thorn branches into a crown and put it on his head, and they placed a reed stick in his right hand as a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mockery and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him and grabbed the stick and struck him on the head with it. When they were finally tired of mocking him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him again. Then they led him away to be crucified. Along the way, they came across a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. And then they went out to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. The soldiers gave Jesus wine mixed with bitter gall, but when he had tasted it, he refused to drink it. After they had nailed him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for his clothing and by throwing dice. Then they sat around and kept guard as he hung there. A A sign was fastened above Jesus' head announcing the charge against him. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Jesus, the enemy of the state, is put to death. The officers are given the order to carry out his sentence by manner of crucifixion, but these officers, before carrying out their duty, beat him, mock him, spit on him, and abuse him, after which they redress him in the original clothes they stripped him in before continuing with the orders given them. This is a clear illustration of the nature of men when given power by the state. These officers who unlawfully abuse this man will never be tried in their courts for their behavior. They will never be fired for misconduct, and they will never be held to the same standard which they use to judge others. Not in this world. They were everyday men with families, children, normal lives who needed to make a living just like everyone else. But these men sold themselves, along with their morals, to the state. They were officers simply doing their jobs, bystanders, watched from the crowds as the criminal hung on the cross, mumbling amongst themselves, he should have just complied. But Jesus, from the very moment of his birth through to the very final moments of his death, never ceased to live a life of godly defiance. And that's going to conclude part 2 of Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end of the enemy of the state.